Welcome everyone. We're going to give it a couple of minutes just while everyone's joining. We've got about 19 people on the call if you look in the top right, and you can see how many, 21 now. So we're going to give it a couple of minutes until people arrive. I'll just give you a sort of some of you might have been here before in this virtual room, but I'll give you a sort of quick tour while we're waiting for everyone. So I'm James, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Arbor. So I'll be comparing this. So you'll see on the right-hand side, there's this chat area. So you can type stuff in there. Oops, I've misspelled hello, but there you go, hello. Use this area to interact with each other throughout, ask questions, you can upload files, comment. This is your space to kind of interact. You'll also see this questions tab on the top right. So as we go through, we'll start to move questions into here, or you can ask them direct. You can vote up and down. So we're going to we'll have maybe one or two questions during Loic's presentation, but at the end, we've got loads of time, so we'll try and get through all of them, starting with the highest voted ones, just to make it semi-democratic. And then on the far right-hand side, you've got all the people who are in this chat. So if you click there, you can hopefully see some colleagues, some friends. We've got some people have put their email, so you can see what trust they're from. So you've got Victorious, Leo, I've got New Schools Network, Berkshire Schools Trust, etc., etc., etc. So do have a flick through, and you can chat directly to people if you want. A note to say that we are being recorded now, so everything here is recorded. You'll get sent this at the end as well, so don't worry, you don't have to take notes unless you really want to. And I'm sure if you have any questions as well, we'll give some contact details so you can follow up at the end. We're on about 20. Oh, it's still ticking up a little bit. 26, getting there. I'll give it another 30 seconds before I hand over to Loic and Tim. We're going to kind of introduce themselves on the chat. Well, that was it. I'll give it 3 seconds and then we can introduce it. So I'm James, CEO and co-founder of Arbor. We've been doing these webinars now for 3 years. It feels like 3 years. It's been about 3 months of trying to bring to light emerging areas of good practice, of trusts. So with all the change going on, we want to kind of give some beacons of excellence, how people are performing in different areas. Today, we're going to be talking about benchmarking. And how to kind of benchmark your map, especially important in light of the fact that the performance tables, there will be no performance tables tomorrow. So tomorrow being next year. So it's a really interesting opportunity for MATs. This is kind of a time where we can rewrite the rule book and have more flexibility. Also a time where there are no guidelines yet. So it could be a really interesting opportunity. We'll be going through some of the work that Arbor does in this area. So Arbor is a management information system, a cloud-based management information system and data platform for schools. So we have kind of 1,100 schools using our MIS, cloud-based MIS, and over 100 MATs, and more MATs than any other provider. And we're growing really quickly as schools need cloud-based systems to operate remotely, which is particularly relevant at this time. We also provide a free benchmarking service, which is kind of where this comes in. So on that note, maybe I'll hand over to Tim to introduce himself and explain a bit before coming to Loic.
Great, thank you, James. So my name is Tim Ward. I'm a senior partnership manager here at Arbor. So I work closely with schools and MATs to find them the best solution for their school operations needs in our MIS. My background, I'm a former primary head teacher, and I've also spent 12 years now on and off working in school improvement roles. So I've got a real interest in making data-driven decisions and assisting school leadership and MAT leadership teams in doing that. So that's a little bit about myself. Loic, over to you.
Okay, hi, nice to see everyone. I will just share my screen so that I can take you through what I'm going to be talking about today.
Also, we haven't mentioned, but we didn't even plan this, but look at how synced we all are wearing our white shirts. It's just
Okay, cool. Right, so I am going to talk to you today a little bit about the origins of the report that you'll have seen, the free MAT report, and where the idea for it came from. I've been working now with Arbor for quite a few years on these free reports, and this year's reports have had a little bit of a shift in focus. I want to talk about that and the thinking behind that approach. And it kind of comes from 3 insights, which are quite obvious insights, but the question of how they interact with each other is a lot less obvious. So firstly, the fact that school context varies, that this is linked to outcomes, and that when you look at different maps, they've got very different strategies and very different operations. And there's a big question about how each of those things works together. And the idea that kind of drove the shaping of the report this year was about what kind of information can we provide that is going to help people to explore that link and to understand it and make informed decisions that are a lot more nuanced than might be from some of the more traditional approaches to just benchmarking schools. So I'm going to talk through those 3 points today, and the sort of story about how I became so interested in those 3 areas. But perhaps then to set out where that kind of story starts, to introduce myself. I've been in the education and youth sector for nearly 20 years, starting off as a youth worker in Cambridge, so in a slightly different part of the sector. And then I moved into schools. I taught in northwest London at St George's School in near Maida Vale. And then just over 10 years ago, I moved out of schools and set up the Centre for Education and Youth, which is about kind of bridging those 2 worlds of the education and youth sector, but also about informing what goes on in schools better through research and better understanding of policy, whilst in the other direction, informing policymakers much more using proper research and insight from what's going on in schools. So that kind of background is why I became quite geekily interested in a lot of the questions that have shaped this report. And the first part of the origins of this report start in around 2012, I think, when someone who some of you may remember, Chris Cook, who was at the time the education editor at the Financial Times, started doing a lot of research on variation in school performance by region. And he really cast the light on the high performance of London schools, which is something I became really interested in. And in 2014, I published a big report called Lessons from London Schools, looking at why London schools were doing so well and trying to unpick all the different factors behind that. But after that came out, we actually realized that we'd massively underestimated a lot of the contextual factors that were impacting on London schools. So we realized that a lot of those contextual questions that are flagged in the MAT report, the other MAT report, were actually much more important than we'd realized at the time. So perhaps in a sort of subconscious effort to try and compensate for having underestimated that the first time, I then started to do more and more research on this question. And I became really interested in this data set that you will see referred to in the MAT report that looks at area types. So for example, I did this comparison looking at Kingston upon Hull and Kingston upon Thames, and looking at what was different about those areas and how that linked to educational achievement. And I started spending a lot of time with these maps of different areas of the country and really granular data about who was living there and what that meant for achievement. And if you look at those different areas, and these are actually the broadest categories in that data set, there's actually far more granular data in there. If you look at these top area types, you can see that they vary hugely when it comes to FSM and when it comes to attainment. But the interesting thing I noticed when I looked at this table was the fact that if you look at the 2 most highly performing areas, the area types, the affluent England and London cosmopolitan, yet they're actually the areas with the most contrasting FSM levels. So that made me think what we needed was a much more sophisticated exploration of context than just looking at the usual single continuum of deprivation level. Because when I then plotted these things out into this very colourful, quite exciting graph, but somewhat difficult to read one, and I looked at the relationship between educational achievement and disadvantage in different areas, and saw that the patterns were completely different depending on the area type, because these area types are so much more sophisticated in terms of characterizing a school or a maths context. And it struck me that this was really useful information for school leaders because it helped them to understand the particular characteristics of their area and some of the things they might need to respond to. And that's where we saw that actually the relationship between deprivation and school achievement is completely different in those different area types. And it was really exciting to get an opportunity to put that information into the reports that have then gone to so many different mats. So that I'm going to call the sort of chapter 1 of my interest in this area and the origins of this report. The second one is another report I authored a couple of years ago with Ambition School Leadership, now the Ambition Institute. And this one was looking at MAT leadership and operations. And we started off that report with a hypothesis that different MATs had a different vision, and that they therefore had to develop a strategy to achieve that vision, and that would then shape their operations, and that their operations would be more or less centralized depending on what they were trying to achieve. But what we found once we actually started our analysis, which involved surveying, I think, about 25 different MATs and interviewing, I think, 44 MAT chief execs. So we may well have interviewed some of you over the course of that. And we looked at that information and we realized that actually it wasn't just a case of, again, one continuum in terms of centralization. There were different things that different MATs centralized. And that was often quite a pragmatic decision based on the context, how fast the MAT had grown, how varied the schools within that MAT were. And that was constantly changing. So MATs were hitting these breakpoints as they grew, and that meant that their strategy needed to change or their operations needed to change, and that they might want to centralize different things at different times. So again, you'll see that the report that you've all had from Arbor tries to help with some of that by understanding what is the difference between the schools within a MAT and how is it changing. And that can tie into then what we found about the different strategies. We looked at a whole different set of strategies that a MAT might choose to perform, and we found that different things, they prioritized different types of strategies to different extents, depending on where they were at. So as you can see, there's basically these two different sides of my interest and two different sides of things that I think are so important for leaders in schools to be thinking about. And that's why I was really keen to work with Arbor on this year's report in the way that it's come out to provide that information and inform some of the conversations that need to go into the decisions about these types of strategies and the operational decisions that go with them. Because that actually can start to feed into how your particular approach to school improvement. And we set out in that report on MATs a set of 5 different school improvement models that were kind of best fit characterizations of the approaches MATs were taking, depending on their context. So I'll finish there. I've put some links to those reports if you want to find out a little bit more about them. But I'm also happy to chat about them if you want to contact me at any point. We can talk about it more, but obviously we've got time for questions now. So keen to hear what you think.
I'll jump in with one, Loic, before you take something from the crowd. With performance tables being abolished this year, what do you think? How do you think schools and MATs are going to or should benchmark themselves? That's a hard one.
Well, it's hard. I mean, I think that firstly, a single year's data is never the thing that should be making it your decision shouldn't be based on a single year's data anyway. I've long been campaigning for the use of multi-year measures in league tables. So I think that actually it's not that 1 year that's going to tell you. You should have the information about immediate trends and changes in that particular year from your own experience of your schools, your knowledge of them, and your internal data. So it's not necessarily external comparative data to other schools that you need on a single year basis in order to be able to make decisions. So I don't think people will necessarily be despairing about not having that information. And I think there's also opportunities for people to collaborate and make comparisons more informally. So I think it will very much change the way we're used to doing things, but I don't think it needs to really get in the way of the real meaningful stuff of school improvement.
And what do you think the opportunities are? It's an open playing field next year. You've done some really interesting work using more nuanced benchmarks based on sort of different population types, for example. What are some of the other things that you think, like now it's an open goal? Well, iron and gold, but it's an open playing field. So what's some of the other things you've been thinking about and researching that schools could kind of draw on next year for benchmarking purposes?
Yeah, so well, beyond just benchmarking, actually, I mean, we're about to publish a report called Making Waves, which is about how schools and MATs are innovating in assessment and how they're going about experimenting and doing new things. And we're finding that actually lots of people are taking the initiative and developing new ways of assessing, really based on what is the information you want to know. So, you know, whether that be schools that are wanting to monitor the more well-being focused interventions by using something like impact ed, where they're looking at using metrics for wider skills and wider developmental outcomes and being able to benchmark those, or whether it's MATs we've seen who have developed really interesting models of cascading information all the way from the classroom level through kind of rich discussions with heads of year or heads of department, and then feeding that up in a much more action-focused conversation. So I think people will be looking to doing things in new ways that will be more directly tied to making decisions that can actually inform teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting where assessment will go as well, especially I think that's going to be an area of innovation. It's something that we're thinking about as well from an Arbor point of view, is what we can do with the data that we have across all of our 1,000 schools, because that forms its own benchmark. So can't say much more on that now, but that's something that we're definitely looking at right now, and hopefully we'll be able to share some stuff with everyone soon. Tim, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can do. I think the thing that I felt when I looked through that table you showed us about the relevance of, or the impact of, deprivation in the different area types. Coming from a school improvement background and working as a school improvement advisor, you would regularly go to a school who were always obviously acutely aware of their local needs. But in your research, did you actually find that schools and MATs, whilst they knew about their contacts, did they realise the actual scale of the impact was having? Because if you look at the correlation aspect that you didn't show in your table, you know, in the London area, it's like in the hundredths, and whereas it's like 0.6 of for countryside living. Were they aware of just how deep that impact was, or was it more a hunch that they had?
My sense is that people might know their own context, but they don't necessarily know how that contrasts with another context. And there are elements that have been underestimated. So the key thing we underestimated in our research on London schools was the impact of immigration status and the different attitudes to education that prevailed in different communities. So that's research that Professor Simon Burgess in Bristol has really led the way in. And so I think that whilst school leaders quite often refer to whether they have aspirational parents and that type of thing, understanding how that differs and what might be feeding into it, and forcing that conversation about, okay, well, what does that mean and how do we change those things? And particularly, what is the mix within our MAT? Because often you'll have a MAT leader who's come from a school within the MAT, for example, who might not necessarily realise just how different that school is to another school in the MAT. So recognising some of that, those questions around how much coherence there is within a MAT and how much variation, and that then guiding decisions about how much standardization you have across the MAT becomes quite important.
I have a question that came up. This is, again, maybe it's unfair, but you have a go. Given the lack of official benchmarking data next year, there may be some around attendance, but not much more. How do you think MAT should use the Arbor report at a governor board level? And how do you think MATs should use the report when and if Ofsted come in?
Well, I think it's about having it as information to inform the conversations that should be going on day to day anyway. So it means when you're having those conversations, say about curriculum that a lot of people are having at the moment and have had in the last couple of years as the Ofsted framework has changed, it's about saying, well, what do we know about our communities, and what do we know about the trajectory of the schools within our MAT, in order that we might want to take into account when shaping that curriculum. And I think looking at the MAT report and having that benchmarking provides quite a good starting point for that conversation, because whilst one has, as a school leader, has that kind of feel for your school, it's not necessarily always as easy to articulate, and it's not as easy to communicate to governors all the time. So I think in some of those conversations with governors, to be able to set that out and show how your math is different to some other maths can be really helpful in the normal course of the conversations that one's having about school improvement.
Good. And for any of those people who are interested, I'm just going to post a link so you can sign up for free and get your MAT report while Loic's talking, so you can have a look at it yourself. Maybe you can answer questions live on your MAT report. I'm joking. We had a question from Simon. Loic, if you can look in the chat there. Have you looked at anything to do with mobility and how long a child stays at school, and whether there's a correlation between time in school and outcomes?
I haven't done, and one of the things that I think it can be a challenge with some of the progress measures is mobility, because I know that this is one of the things when Progress 8 was first being developed that I flagged to the DFE is that schools with very high mobility can have extremely unreliable figures as a result of that mobility. So it's not something I've looked at as part of this, but I'm very aware that it plays an important role in how well pupils are progressing themselves, and B, in terms of the school's data. I know, for example, that it's something that is a lot of people looking at the kind of armed forces and children of military families are quite concerned about, and some of the military charities have looked at it a lot because it obviously impacts disproportionately on young people from those backgrounds. So I'm aware of it's an issue, but I haven't done a lot of work on it personally.
No. Fair enough. Tim, do you have any other questions?
At this stage, I don't think I do. I think perhaps more questions will come as we actually look at the report, which we're going to do in the next section of the webinar. So, Loic, if you can hang on for that, that would be great. Sure. And we'll see if any questions come together at the end. Thanks for sharing that link. James has just put the link in the chat bar. Beverly's just asked if the report's interactive. I think that'll become clear as we go through about the differences between Arbor Insight as a portal and Arbor Insight as a report. So I think actually that's a great jumping off point to go into that question itself. So at this stage, I'm just going to rearrange my windows and then share my screen with everybody. And we're going to use a bit of a presentation for the next section to take you through the Insight report itself. So assuming I'm going to share the right one. Nervous moment. Brilliant. So a very interesting white slide. So we're going to look at the next 2 bits, and I'm going to lead on this, and Loic will be here to answer questions at the end of this, and so will James and I. So we're going to look at the report itself by looking at a fictional MAT report and thinking of how that applies to you and how the report's designed to help you make those data-driven decisions, and the gap that we think the report plugs in the current suite of tools you might look at. But we're also going to spend some time looking at the Arbor Insight portal itself, and that is interactive, and that's something that you can use. And I think both of these things come out of something that's quite unique about Arbor as a company. So our investors are social impact investors, and that has a great impact on the way that this company works. And one of the things is we really want every school to make the best use of all the available data sets and to save lots of school leaders time. And we don't want you to be crunching that data. We want you to have a good view of it without having to crunch it all. And so one of the reasons we can give these tools away for free to every MAT in the UK is because of that social impact agenda for us as a company. That's a really important point to make. So we're going to look at 2 things next as part of this and how they can impact on those data-driven decisions. So I thought to supplement James's link in the chat, we probably ought to think about practicalities for those who've not done this yet. So really briefly, any MAT can sign up to these reports for free. Just go to Arbor's website, arbor-education.com, and click that green sign up button. You can see the lozenge in the end. Stick your email address in. Actually, before you do that, make sure you click the MAT button that you can see me pointing out, or the icon pointing out here, and then search for the name of your MAT. And if we recognize your email address, you'll get straight access to that, and it will guide you through that process. Logging in is just as easy. You just need to go to our webpage and click the login button instead of sign up. So you can do that now if you wish, or you can do that after this presentation. So once you've got logged in, what's the purpose of the report? How's it structured, and how does it work? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually how you get hold of it. So I'm just going to swizz across screens here to typically, I've timed out. I'll come back to this in a second. So you get the report from your Arbor Insight portal, and I'll come back to that and faff for that so I don't spoil the flow of this best laid plan getting organised. But once you've got the report, you're going to find that it's in several sections. And after you've got past the title page with your map name on, you'll find there's a couple of pages that are explaining a bit about Arbor, how the report was generated, where the data's come from, and how to use the colour coding, for example, in the reports. But actually the bit that I thought was really interesting was the way that we structured this to mirror the Ofsted summary inspections of maths. So in very much in the same structure as those, and I think that's important. I always used to say I wanted to know what the inspectors saw before they came through the door. And so this contents page gives you an idea of that. We've got the area introduction pages we've just seen. Then we've got a section about your mat, and that's looking at that area type blend Loic talked about in his research. Your mat in terms of its size, its phase and its growth, and also its pupil characteristics, and they can give some really interesting contrasts. And then sections that look at your school's performance in terms of the benchmarking from ASP from the previous year's benchmarking data set. And as that's the only data set we've got and will have for some time that's on a national basis, I think it still bears some weight. So moving on to the actual area type itself, and this is where we get the area type blends. So you can see here that I've actually referenced a page from the appendix at the back with that map of the UK that Loic shared with us earlier as well. And then you'll get your own maths area type blend on the next page. So in this sample map we've got, you can see that we've got a map with 7 schools in the services and industrial legacy area and just 1 in the countryside living area. And when I was talking to Loic, I was talking about the correlation between free school meals and academic performance. And the greatest impact of free school meals in depressing academic performance exists in, the greatest correlation exists in countryside living schools. So those urban schools, maybe from my own home area, right out on the east coast of Lincolnshire, where that has seemed to have a greater impact. So for this map, they need to be thinking about the spread of their schools. And all the way through this report, what we've tried to do is not show you the absolute data, but show you that spread across your school, your mat, so you can be aware of the impact that it might have. So I wonder what your mat might say, your report will say about your mat. It might just open your eyes to the different area types that there are within the mat. In that way that, like I mentioned, school leaders will often talk about the context of their school, but can we put a number on the impact it's likely to have? So the next 3 pages are about your size, phase and growth, and I think they're really good to take as 3 pages together before you draw your conclusions. So this page talks about your size by number of schools, where you sit within the bulk of maths. So this mat, for example, sits in the 6 to 11 size, and you can see that there are actually relatively small numbers of maths that are actually much bigger than 11 schools. And this mat is also in that group of 303 others, whereas the 814 schools sit in the smaller band. So we're relatively large by number of schools. We're not in that very largest group, but we're not in the most common group. It's worth noting that always, your eye is always drawn to the tables. Don't forget to call out at the top. It has some interesting data in it normally. We can see that the average mat size is just 6 schools. So we're slightly bigger than that. We're in that big group. So gives us context of how big we are in terms of numbers of schools. And that begins to tie into our operating model and how complex we are as an operation. The bigger that mats come off, and very often there's a point where you get a lot of centralisation. But if you've got that spread of different area types, is that the right operating model for us? And these reports always just pose the questions, I guess, rather than providing the answers. So we've also provided an analysis of your blend of phases. So again, it shows your spread, and this is a map that's quite heavily primary, 6 primaries to 2 secondary schools. And that's going to give you an idea about, again, the complexity of your operation and how you need to work your operating model, whether you're going to work in a cluster style or whether you're going to group primary heads together, for example. And the final page in this trio is your growth in the last 3 years. So how is your map changing and evolving over time? Can we see that in a picture? And how does that compare to the average change across maps in the UK? And you can see that on average, this map's grown at growing at roughly the same pace as the average across maths in the country, that's growing by 20%. But how is your math changing? So taking these three things into account, your area type blend, the spread of phases, and your growth, your historical growth and your growth plans, how does that impact on your operating model? So we've also decided to look at maths by pupil characteristics, and I think this is can give a really different insight to just looking at numbers of schools. And this is really obvious in this example, and yours may show a different trend too. So thinking about your map, how many pupils do you serve? So you can see here, this map sits on the sort of the tail, just the beginnings of the tail end of that sort of bell curve shape. They serve quite a large number of pupils, nearly 3,000. And it's bigger than the average map, which serves just over 2.5. But it's also in that sort of group with 238 others. And again, you know, it wouldn't take many more students to actually tip them into the 3001 category, because they're right on that cusp, aren't they, by 6 children or 46 children. And so then they'd be in this big category of sort of very large by numbers of pupils. And that happens if you've got a lot of large urban multi-form entry primary schools or secondary schools. And again, that's a really good idea about how complex your math operations are likely to be. So that's why we've done the spread of the number of pupils. In this particular map, you can see that they've got a low number of disadvantaged pupils. So that's really interesting. They've got one school in that countryside living area. But actually, sorry, they've got a high proportion of free school meal pupils across the mat as a whole. And they're likely to have a different impact in those different areas according to Loic's research. So it gives us an idea of where we sit against other schools that are maths in the UK. And I like the fact it shows me the math average, so we're showing 24.6%. And then we've got 2 more pages that show details around where you sit in terms of SEN pupil proportions and EAL. And your mat will have a different driver, but this mat is clearly going to be those disadvantaged pupils because their proportions of SEN and EAL pupils are relatively low. They're also in the most common categories for those, so they're not outstanding or unusual in those aspects. And the final part of this report now looks at schools' performance, and there's a lot of aspects to our school performance benchmarkings, metrics we might use, so I'm not going to show you them all. But the sections around every key stage that's relevant to your map. So here's one from key stage 2, for example, for this relevant map. So thinking about what we found out about this trust already, what's their story? We know that they're quite large in terms of pupil numbers. They've got multiple mixed phases, primary and secondary. They've got a large proportion of disadvantaged pupils and just one school that's in countryside living. How's that going to impact on this progress? So we can see, taking this metrics again, we've got a spread of schools in our primary sector, some of whose progress score is below the national average and coloured orange, one of which is working around the national average and one of which is working above. So again, my brain's going and saying, maybe these schools are the ones that are in certain areas and area types. So this is about pulling that story together and saying, this is the story of our performance. How does our context impact on that? And then there's more pages. You can see we've got expected standard and scaled scores and progress scores as well in the same style. And we do a similar thing for Key Stage 4. So we've got Attainment 8, Progress 8, strong passes in English and Maths, and EBAC type metrics. So the final section of the report is the reading around Loic's research. So you can see that we've got that map again and the table that I referred to and more pages around that research. And this is where I refer to that correlation between disadvantage and attainment. And you can see it's much, much higher in that countryside living area, 0.58, than it is in services and industrial legacy, which are present in this map. So I want to move on now to think about the Insight portal, and this is where I'm going to have to re-log on. So my apologies for this. I had it all prepared and then I've been talking too long. So just 2 seconds while I do this. Best laid plans. So this is the Insight portal that's free and available to all maths in the UK. And this is the place where you'll come and you'll start to download your report. 2 seconds. Rural broadband is not always great when you're webinar webbing as well. So it's really easy to get to. All you need to do is to click the Understanding Your Math Report link on the top of the blue banner here. And you can see that you can easily download your report from here with the download button. You may also notice there's a section for all the schools that exist in your trust, and you could download reports for those. We have 3 types of report in Arbor. We have the free reports, which includes the map report. We have premium reports that you can optionally buy. We also have financial benchmarking reports. So you can download these. And the reason I love these is because school leaders often spend too much time having to pull data together and present it to different audiences. With the Arbor Insight reports, that's not necessary. We pull it all together for you. And it also means you can have a really good shared conversation between Matt Central staff or school improvement teams and the schools themselves. So you can both download exactly the same data set, and instead of spending time getting to know the data representation, you get to know the data itself, and then the conversation moves much more quickly onto school improvement actions. But there is more to the Arbor Insight portal than most people realise. So if I just go back to the homepage by clicking the school logo or the Matt logo, you'll see there are also interactive dashboards, and you can get to them from the front page or from the analytics menu. And really simply, for example, if you want to know the group context, you can click on the numbers of students on roll, remembering that this is a snapshot from that ASP data set, but it's really quick and easy to see comparisons and year-on-year trends. So we can see that this academy, for example, has grown significantly in terms of its roll. And we have the same analytics options for attendance, behaviour, attainment and progress, for example, and a range of other metrics. And these are all taken from ASP. So if you look at reading, writing, maths combined, you can easily see which schools of yours are doing well. We also split that by demographic and by ethnicity. So this is the Matt dashboard approach, and you can easily see that and work with it for free from all your schools. This is, of course, only a snapshot of data. This is not all the data. This is simply your ASP data set. There's far more that you may need to work with. So you may need to think about looking at your live data. So I'm just going to whiz across now and log in again. So if you're an Arbor school, I know that we've got some customers on the call today, you can see that you can get easily to your live Matt data. And that's another part of what you need to do. So you can see that logging into this, we combine your live data with your ASP data set. So when I go into the analytics here and click on group context, what I'm now seeing is live data. So this number of students is today's data. You can see it's labeled with that. And again, we're providing you with these drill downs straight into this. You don't need to have a degree in Power BI. You don't need to be able to work with the data or combine it. We've done that from all the separate Arbor sites, which means we can also do things like give monthly trends and year-on-year trends as well. So the dashboard is designed to pull that all together, and that's interesting to see that actually in terms of free school meal percentages, I can click on those and see my live percentages, and they may be different to those the DFE performance data show. I really like the all measures page as well. Let me choose something that actually has got a trend rather than free school meal. So bear with me, let me go into Key Stage 2 performance. So the all measures box is also really, really useful because it gives you all the different measures that we've got down the side. And it also gives you your group data on the top. By the way, you can use the all measures tab in the free group insight product as well. But I really like the fact that it gives you that across time and gives you trend lines too. Now, for our Matt customers, they don't need to go to two separate portals. Now they've got the live data view of their analytics. What they don't need to do is go step up somewhere else for that ASP data because it's here on the menu under DFE assessment. So you don't suddenly lose that and have to get a separate place to go and get it. Simply get it from the same place. And finally, I think one of the great things about having it live is the fact that you can start to really make those data-driven decisions and drive them through, including around staff and HR, and you can take action because once you're a live customer, it's really easy to log on to an individual school MIS, any of those that you've got permissions for. If I could type, it would help. So if I want to go to Ward Primary School, it's a couple of clicks and I'm there. This is the now in an individual school MIS site. So we've got a range of systems that will help you to make data-driven decisions with your live data, with your benchmarking data, and by using the report itself, looking at the spread of your schools and the impact that might have and how you're going to change your approach. So we've shown you three things. We've shown you understanding a Matt report, and that uses ASP and the ONS data together and shows you the spread across your map. We've shown you the Arbor Insight portal, which pulls your ASP data in, but actually lets you drill down to individual schools and the absolute data behind those. So once you've got your questions raised by the report, you can drill further in. Both of these are free to use. And then finally, Arbor's Group MIS that brings together both live and ASP data to get the fullest picture possible. So shall we have a look at some of the questions now, James?
Yeah, you got one from Dawn, which is pertinent, which is like the date, you know, ASP data is now almost a year out of date. When can we access more recent data? So you kind of touched a bit on that with the MIS data. That's how we get the live data that Tim was talking about in the group MIS. So you can get data from each of your schools, and the group MIS pulls that all up into a group MIS, so you can interrogate that down from a, you know, all the way from a mat all the way down to an individual student. But you have to have Arbor in every school. That's the limitation on that. In terms of ASP data, TBC, what's going to be coming out next year, there probably will be some attendance stuff because the government have been collecting that. But in terms of the census, it's going to be very limited. So you won't have a lot to work on in terms of benchmarking externally, which is why we are looking at doing something ourselves. And, you know, Matt's are looking at doing something informally, and perhaps you want to pool your data. I don't know if Loic, you had a view on that, like what the government will be doing next year.
I mean, it's quite categorically pledged that it's not going to be publishing data from these current assessments that are being made. So it would have to do some serious backtracking. I mean, those things aren't unheard of from government, as we know. But I think it would be hard for it to do much with the data that's being submitted this year. I'm sure people will find ways of doing things. So I know that there's been some analysis already in terms of the grades that people are submitting. So there might be opportunities to benchmark it based on some kind of open data that's pulled from somewhere. But I think all of that is going to be a question of what people want to share and what they feel comfortable doing with it.
Cool. And Tim, you got that question on the screen. Is ASP data in your MIS too? Do you want to take that one?
I can take that one. So the answer to that is yes, it is. You can get access to ASP data from your Insight portal at both group MIS level and individual school MIS level. So it's trying to make sure that everything is together in the one place, and that you're not having to search around for different parts of the system to get it together. So yes, it's present in both MAT and single MIS instances. There was another question from Kate, which I think Loic answered on the chat, which I thought was really interesting. She asked about the correlation between outcomes at Key Stage 2 and disadvantaged, because Loic's research focused on Key Stage 4 outcomes. And Loic, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, my expectation is that the patterns would, once it gets to the kind of macro level of the whole areas, I suspect the patterns will be similar, because overall patterns tend to be fairly similar. I know that there are certain kind of quirks in that. So for example, there's long been a story about how in the northeast primary schools overachieve compared to secondary schools. And so that might result in slightly different trends. But I suspect once the data gets aggregated widely enough across the different areas, the patterns are likely to be similar. But I can actually, I'll run that and have a look.
Okay. Cool. I'd be really interested to see that as well. I think that's really good. I'm just trying to see if there are any more.
Simon's got a question, which was, does this focus on reception year 2 and year 6 or all year groups? You want to take that one, Tim? So
it naturally, because the report is generated from ASP data, and that ASP data set comes from statutory assessment points. So the report itself, and both that and the Insight portal, do focus on early years, year 2, year 6, and Key Stage 4, end of Key Stage 4 outcomes, because they're the only data points that the government collects statutory data for. And we take the data. We've got we won the tender to have a contract from the DfE to handle ASP data directly. So that's why it's always limited to those statutory assessment points at this stage. Obviously, the group MIS, when you're starting to get into live data, allows you to look at data points from any year group at any point, depending on your assessment and tracking regime.
Great, thanks, Tim. Any other questions? We've got one coming up. Oh no, we've answered that one. I think that is it. And we are, oh, and thanks, Dawn. I'll get back to your email. I think that we're at time as well, so I'm conscious that everyone's got a lot to get on with. So I think we're going to say thank you. Is there anyone who's doing a wrap up that I'm unaware of?
Yeah, I was going to do that.
Okay.
So I've left my slides up on screen. So just to let you know, thanks very much for coming. Loic, thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have you. If you've enjoyed this webinar, please do join some of our others. We've got my colleague Daniel running a session on the group MIS. We'll demonstrate that live. And we've also got Kate Davis, who I believe is attending today, is the CEO of Whitewood Primary Academy Trust, talking on the 3rd of July about maths centralisation versus school autonomy during COVID. I'm really interested to go to that one. And finally, please do get in touch if you've got any more questions. You can see that we've got the email address for James and the telephone number and web at the bottom of this slide. Don't forget, once this webinar's over, you'll get an email through to whichever email address you've registered with, and you can watch the recording back. So listen to any of the questions or answers again. Thanks very much, everyone.
Look forward to hearing from you. Have a good weekend, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks.